Welcome. Let's talk about Spring Framework. First, let's talk about what is a framework. A framework is nothing but a platform or a foundation that is used to develop software applications. For example, a framework provides us a lot of things like classes, libraries, functions. Using all these things, we can work together and build a complete end-to-end application. So in the framework in a broader sense helps us to structure our code of our application and build the technical solutions very easily. Hence, Spring is one of a framework which was developed by Rod Johnson in 2003. And what is the purpose of Spring framework? It helps to do easy development of Java enterprise applications. So with Spring framework, Java enterprise application development is becoming much easier. So Spring framework is a lightweight framework and it can be thought of frameworks. Why? Because Spring supports multiple other frameworks like Struts, Hibernate. Hence, Spring is also called as frameworks of framework. If you look into the core of Spring framework, it comprises of many components, many modules like IOC, AOP. IOC is inversion of control, AOP is aspect oriented programming, DAO, data access object, ORM, object relation mapping, web, and MVC. So if we look at this picture, these are all the modules of Spring Framework. So this part deals with the data access and interaction with the database. This part deals with the interaction with the front-end web interface or UI part. This part is more from the cross-cutting concerns, aspect-oriented programming. And this part deals with mostly the bean dependency injections, those kind of things like creation of a Java class, its object, and management of that object lifecycle and its destruction. This part covers that. And of course, we have something called as the test. This module of Spring Framework deals with the testing capability. So let's look at what is inversion of control. So of control is a design pattern that is used to remove the dependency from programming code. So what I mean by that is, let's say there is a class called employee. In that we have a member reference of address. So the creation of the employee object here is now dependent on creation of address object. So only if the address object will be successfully created, only then the employee object can be created, because creation of the address object is inside the constructor of employee object. Hence, if the address object creation fails, which means the object creation for employee will also fail. That is not good. Hence, this is kind of a tight coupling. But what inversion of control does is it makes things easier. So instead of having the creation of the employee object inside the constructor, we will not keep that. Instead, we will create the employee address objects outside. And when we are trying to create the object of employee, we will pass the address object as the parameter to the constructor. And this reference is now getting assigned. So now, if we are not able to pass anything of the address, then our employee object is not dependent on it. So our employee object creation will happen properly without the dependency of address. So this is called inversion of control, which makes it easy and decoupled to handle objects and their life cycle. So IOC makes the code loosely coupled, and in such case there is no need to modify the code logic if our environment is moved to a new environment. So in Spring Framework, the IOC container is responsible to do dependency injection. That's what we saw here. The whole thing about bean creation and dependency injection is controlled by inversion of control design pattern. So let's understand what is a Spring Bean. So bean is just another Java class whose object creation and destruction will be managed by Spring Framework. So any Java class whose object creation and destruction of that object, releasing of the memory, is managed by Spring Framework, then we will call that Java class as a bean. So Spring Bean has many scopes. Every scope decide how many instances of the class or the bean instance will be created and used. So what it means is the same class can have multiple scope. And how does it depend which scope is what? Based upon how many instances of that class will get created or the bean will get created. So to start with, let's say singleton scope. So in this scope, for a particular bean or for a particular class, only one instance of the object will get created and that will be reused. And this is also the default bean scope of Spring IOC container. Next bean scope is prototype. Here what happens? Multiple instances of the one class gets created. So here we will have one bean with many number of objects. After that we have request scope. In this scope, the the bean lifecycle or the scope of the bean object will depend upon the HTTP request. Until the time HTTP request is valid, the bean memory is valid. Then we have HTTP session. This is a bean whose scope will be valid for a complete HTTP session, which means it will be valid between multiple requests. Then we have global session. This scope of the bean definition is tied to a global session. So even this is tied to the user session and this is tied to the global session. Now let's talk about what is Spring Boot. So Spring Boot is an open source Java based framework used to create microservices. So Spring Boot is nothing different than Spring, but it is a nice way and fast way to start developing microservices or RESTful APIs. So Spring Boot is built up of Spring Framework for faster development of microservices, and it was developed by a pivotal team and is used to build standalone production ready application based on Spring Framework. So there are some Spring Boot annotation. Let's try to understand. At the rate bean, if we create a method with a name and create a new object from that method and declare this at the top of this as a bean at the top of this method, then now this will return a singleton bean whose scope will be managed by Spring. Similarly, auto-add. Auto-add is a way to pass one instance of one object to another class instance. So here in the employee, the instance of person P object will be passed from outside and assigned to this P. This is called object auto-adding. We are going to look at all this with examples in upcoming videos. Configuration. Configuration is an annotation used on the classes on which we will define the beans. So the class where we want to do this kind of methods, it should be defined as @configuration class. Also, we can define configuration class on top of any class which we want to make it as a singleton bean. Then we have component scan. Whenever we put a component scan, we define a package. Whichever package we define, now Spring will start to look inside that package for all the singleton beans. And then Spring is going to take care of the memory management for those particular beans. So this is it for this video. I will see you in the next lecture. Thank you.